Can you make Dehya work? This is a funny premise to make about a Genshin character, since in the technical sense, you can make about every character in the game work to an extent you're able to clear content with them. For those who have followed my past videos about Dehya, you probably already know that in pre-release I thought she was a mediocre character with basically no pull value, although maybe not as useless as people thought she would be. After testing her out, my thoughts about her have pretty much remained unchanged. She's a mediocre character, straight up. But even though I made peace with the fact she would be mediocre long ago, something that really frustrated me during beta is that I saw no use case where you could make use of her kit on a team to full extent, and as a result, that made her incoherent in my eyes. In this video, I will analyze whether or not it's possible to make Dehya work as miHoYo probably intended her to be, so as a character that could help the team, both through her offensive and defensive capabilities simultaneously. First of all, let's make something clear about Dehya. Kit-wise, she's not a character that was designed to fill only an offensive or only a defensive role on a team. I think it's important to explain this, because teams where Dehya is only used for her elemental skills defensive utility are pretty popular at the moment. But that's not an Albedo or a Zhongli scenario for her, so not a scenario where you can make the case you're making use of most of Dehya's potential even by taking advantage of just one of her abilities. Characters who have roles that don't require the usage of an elemental burst are not uncommon, but most of them are designed like that by default, so their elemental skill is much stronger than normal as a result. This is not the case for Dehya, as her elemental skill just doesn't provide enough in defensive utility to call her a full-fledged defensive unit, unlike Zhongli, who I just mentioned. In fact, her multitude of effects, namely damage mitigation and interruption resistance for 12 seconds and rotation, make her much more similar to offensive units that have some defensive utility, such as Beidou and Xingqiu. There are some differences in skills duration and damage absorption levels between these characters, but there are enough similarities to say they have the same archetype. Just like Dehya, Beidou and Xingqiu aren't really full-fledged defensive units, so they ended up having offensive parts in their kits that are essential for their role in any team you want to use them on. If you exclude their offensive parts, they're just not worth using over other alternatives. Likewise, Dehya's power budget has been partially distributed in her elemental burst. By itself, the burst does pretty good damage, but suffers from flaws that make reality pretty grim for Dehya. Ignoring small ones, such as it being interrupted by freeze effects or jumping, the objective issues it suffers from are energy requirements and fuel time used. Primarily, the heavy energy issues Dehya suffers from inextricably tie her to Bennett, the only good Pyro battery in the game, who's also a healer, so overlaps with half of Dehya's kit role-wise. Secondarily, the burst damage output is not bad, but not really better than what other characters can replicate with off-field output, so it doesn't excuse the field time she requires. These issues are pretty damning, because they force her to be used in a main carry role if you want to make use of her offensive side, something that indirectly devalues her defensive utility, both because you're forced to slot in another defensive unit alongside her for energy purposes, and because defensive utility in general is much less important if it's not used to protect a long field time carry. If put in contrast with Xingqiu and Beidou's elemental bursts, which are so good that they define their entire identities, the comparison just becomes embarrassing. What I've been trying to say for the past few minutes is that Dehya fails as a character because her flaws make it so you can only really take advantage of one of her two strengths on a specific team, and neither of those are remarkable. In particular, I've tested her performance mainly on mono-pyro teams for her carry roles, and on Ganyu Melt, Yoimiya Vaporize and Burgeon for her elemental skill bot role. Let's start from mono-pyro. The reason I prefer this setup over others such as Reverse Melt for Dehya is simply because the addition of Kazuha to the team adds a lot of utility and flexibility, while still making you maintain similar damage levels. Reverse smelt setups replace Kazuha with one between Rosaria and Ayaka, and that just makes a core which is already in a pretty bad spot due to low overall damage, even worse by removing all of its grouping utility. Still, the team performs decently, mostly because Kazuha and Bennett are such a strong duo that they can carry about every unit you're pairing up with them, granting you're taking advantage of their buffs. With this team, it's absolutely instrumental that you use at least 3 Bennett elemental skills per rotation, and put around 150 to 160 energy recharge on Dehya, otherwise you won't be able to use her burst every rotation. All in all, the team doesn't feel particularly worse than other mono Pyro variants. Dehya's burst feels quite nice in AoE scenarios, since her hits have nice horizontal range that guarantee you can hit every enemy if you've also been able to group them with Kazuha beforehand. Still, I would say this team ranks below something like Klee Mono Pyro, and is just in range with Xinyan Mono Pyro, as Dehya herself just doesn't bring enough to the table in terms of damage for her to look remarkable. For her defensive roles, I've not been able to use her as the only defensive unit on a team on this abyss. Granted that there are pretty tough enemies this time around, such as Consecrated Beasts and the Kenki Trios. The fact is that if you're facing strong enemies, you just can't expect her damage mitigation to be reliable defensively. Luckily for her, on most of the teams she can be used on in this role, characters like Bennett and Shincho are also great options, and adding their defensive effects to the mix definitely helps Dehya. Bennett is obvious since he's a great healer, but Shincho's case is more interesting. People have already been able to run healer-less teams with Shincho in the past, by combining his and Beido's damage reduction effects and being able to survive through damage reduction alone. His synergy with Dehya is similar. Dehya halves the damage a character receives, and then Shincho reduces that half by 42%. The teams where they'll be paired up most commonly, however, is probably Burgeon, but that type of team adds another negative variable to the bunch, the Burgeon explosion damage which also hits your characters. This extra makes it trickier for you to survive without a healer. The silver lining is that replacing somebody like Yelan for a healer such as Barbara and Kokomi is fully doable and actually doesn't change the bloom output of the team particularly. The reason is that Dehya's skill procs are pretty slow, and generally in double Hydro setups, that delay will let you accumulate more than 2 seeds between one proc and the other. This is an issue because, due to how most transformative reactions work, an enemy can't be hit by a reaction of that kind more than 2 times every 0.5 seconds, which means that every additional bloom will be wasted. Even then, the team feels pretty good to use, but that's mostly because it's already strong by default. This is generally how I felt about other teams that can use Dehya's defensive side too. I just think you always have a better option. For Yoimiya, there is nothing that makes Dehya more desirable than someone like Zhongli, since she's not providing any offensive value and is giving you less defensive contribution than him. For Ganyu, in the burning niche, Dehya fits a nice role, as she provides both the consistent pyrotics you need to keep burning active and the interruption resistance you need for Ganyu, but I just don't think this team is that good honestly. By running Dehya instead of somebody like Xianling, you're asking Ganyu to carry the entire damage load of the team, something that doesn't happen on other traditional Ganyu melt teams, where one between Xianling and Kazuha is often used. While from a damage calculation perspective this is not a big difference, having different sources of damage on a team that have different attack range makes teams more consistent in real game scenarios in my experience. So, again, Dehya is an option here, but not a needed one. Other Dehya uses involve something like burning, a team that just doesn't work that well in single target scenarios, and is just meant for AoE content. The team wasn't lacking in pyro application, so what you like from Dehya here is getting the extra damage mitigation to tank all the burning damage your characters will receive. This is not bad, but once again, not a Dehya exclusive, as you can use just about any defensive character on the team for similar results, even pyro ones such as Toma and Xinyan. I think I've painted a pretty clear picture. Dehya is just a replaceable unit, everywhere. There are teams she fits in that can perform well, but never because of her. The reason is that again, her kit is only partially taken advantage of in every team, making it much easier to find units who can do what she can do, but better, as most of them are able to take advantage of their entire kits instead. As a theory crafter, it's always deflating to analyze characters such as these. I don't mean bad characters, but rather characters whose kits are just conceptually flawed. I'm not one to advocate for buffs or changes for bad characters, but I think that these cases deserve consideration of that kind, as Dehya is a true failure of game design.